Today's video is how I did this Labrador puppy in pastels. So as like with most of my portraits, I start off with the eye first. I'm just blocking in the basic shape here before I start adding the colour. I just want to quickly say I am in the process of setting up a Patreon channel, so if that is of interest to you, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me either on my social media, email, or just drop me a comment in the section below. The videos on Patreon will be up to 3 hours long, so considerably slower, a lot of real-time clips. I'll explain you through what I'm doing at each process, so it'll be very much step by step. So if that is of interest, don't hesitate to get in touch. So what I'm doing is I'm just applying a base layer here, and I've used a lot of the Derwent pencils for this. The main colour that I'm using here for the base is the Derwent pastel, and it's the burnt ochre. Now usually I don't actually list the exact colour that I'm using, but for this yellow Labrador, and she was yellow to red type of Labrador, this colour I found was the perfect colour for the base layer. Now as you can see, I am using various colours on top of this, but this I found was just the right colour to mix the reds, various oranges and the browns on top to get the colour that I was aiming for. So I'll start just by applying a mid-tone, and then I'm putting my browns and various other shades on top. Now there's a lot of lighter creams. It looks like a lighter yellow, but it is more on the creamier colour rather than the yellow. I try and avoid yellow if you can when you're doing something like this. Usually if you look at a yellow Labrador, you think, right, well it's got to be a lot of yellow pencils, but that is just not the case. Try and avoid yellow if you can. So there's lots of tans, oranges, reds, like I say, that base of the burnt ochre, and also on the Derwent range there's the tan one as well. I did use that. Now mainly for my highlights for this, in the pencil extender, this one that I'm using now, that is actually the saffron colour from the Derwent range, and that I found to be perfect for layering this kind of highlight on top. At this stage you just want to be mapping in where your basic lights and darks are, so that you then have a good base foundation to then go on and add your details on top. Now this is an A4 size, which is approximately 8 by 12, so for a full body portrait there's quite a lot to fit in a small area. So if you are doing a portrait of a similar size and a full body like this, you want to be focusing more on your values, making sure that your lights are light enough and your darks are dark enough, because there's not going to be the same degree of space to allow you to fit in all that nice detail that you might be able to fit in if you were doing a head and shoulders type portrait with a bit more room. Now for capturing fur like this, especially this colour, the key is loads of layers and blending those various layers together. So you'll notice that I'm going through with the Derwent colours that I mentioned, a brown, and then blending them out, then applying the saffron Derwent on top and blending it out again, applying another brown, and carrying on that way. It's purely because something like this, as with every single fur type really, there is not one set colour that is going to be the absolute, that one pencil that's the perfect colour for that subject. So you need to mix your colours, and that does ultimately come down to the more confident you become and the more time, the different subjects you draw, the different coat colours that you draw, you'll just start to become more confident with which colour you need to pick up. Now that being said, there are many times where I do portraits and I do not know what exact colour that I need. So the amount of times you'll put some, a layer of pencil down and you'll realise that is not the right colour at all. It really doesn't matter. If you're using Pastelmat paper like what I'm using here, it is very forgiving. You can normally, 99% of the time, fix a wrong layer. It's only if you go in with a really, a lot of pressure and a firm hand that you may not be able to get as much of that pigment and cover that over as well. But if you're working in light layers and multiple layers, you really can't do a wrong layer because they're very easy to fix. Now in my Patreon videos, as I say, the video is considerably slower. There is a lot of real-time footage and I explain the exact reason why I'm picking those colours for that subject. So it is broken down at each process, and I'm explaining the reason why you want that colour, which will help if you do struggle with selecting which colour to pick for your subjects. Now another thing you have to bear in mind, the photo that that was taken of the dog or whatever you're drawing, in a slightly different light, those colours are going to be ever so slightly different. So bear that in mind, and the colour that I see will be slightly different to the colour that you see. So it is all about interpreting what you deem as close as you can to the reference photo. There's no right or wrong, and like I say, if you do a wrong layer, just go over it. There's no panic unless you tear your paper or you spill something on it. Usually most things can be fixed, and it's by making these mistakes that you learn and you grow as an artist. So it's just more information that you obtain for yourself that you know not to do on your next portrait. So you can see here I'm using a lot of that saffron Derwent pencil to blend out. It's a really nice layer mixed with that burnt ochre of the Derwent pencil as well. They blend really nicely together to get that really nice warm, it's in between a yellow, you know, like an orangey type tone. So it blended really nice. Now as you can see here, I've sharpened that Derwent saffron pencil to get a nice sharp point because there was a little bit more detail that I wanted to try and get on the muzzle here. But again, look how small the area is. You're not going to get a huge amount of detail in this small area. What you want to be aiming for something like this when you're working full body on this size is you want to hint at the detail rather than putting every single first stroke in. And also, if you are drawing a puppy, they do have much softer fur, so you don't want to be drawing too much detailed fur strokes because you'll make the fur look coarser than what it is. So you need to use a really light hand to get really fine subtle details and create that softness. You don't want anything too sharp. Now you can see how many layers I'm putting down, how many times I'm swapping between the various pencils, going between my lights and my darks. Although you want to start off with a darker mid-tone to build your lights on top, I do always go back with my darker, in this instance, browns and a few darker reds to put some of those shadows in between those lighter areas. And again, this is something that I go into a lot of depth in my longer Patreon videos. When you are working on something smaller like this, the real key to it is keeping your pencils pretty sharp. You don't necessarily want a super sharp point because I keep the sharpest point on my pencils for my very end detailed layers. But you don't want to be working with a blunt pencil because you're trying to, you know, fit as much detail in these layers as you possibly can. In order to do that with pastels, you do need to have a sharper pencil. When you are creating a soft fur like this Labrador puppy, it's more about focusing on your tones and your values. Making sure that these lights and dark areas are in the right place is ensuring that you are following the skeletal structure of that dog. If you put these highlights and shadows in the wrong place, you actually are changing the shape of that animal, and it will not ultimately look like that animal as much as it should. So if the biggest thing when you are putting your base layers down like this and adding your details on top is make sure you follow your reference photo really closely, because you have to follow where these, you know, the highlights and the shadows sit in order to meet the skeletal system of the dog. Now for an area like this, you can use soft pastels or pan pastels. The problem that I find with using those, you can be tempted to put too much pigment down too soon. I get an awful lot of questions about why won't my pastel pencils go over the top of my, you know, the soft pastel area or my pan pastel area. Now that 99% of the time is because you filled all the tooth of the paper. Now I use Pastelmat and I find it really hard to fill the tooth of the paper unless I use soft pastel sticks. I personally haven't tried pan pastels yet, but I imagine you will have that problem if you apply too much pigment to your paper. So most of the time I do like to use my pencils as the base layers, or in my Patreon videos I do use soft pastel sticks, but in a slightly different way. I don't put the soft pastel directly to the paper, so I also go in depth with that as well. But that will just, if by doing it that way, you will not fill the tooth of the paper, unlike if you put the soft pastel sticks and the pan pastels directly to the paper. So if for large areas like this you are finding that your pencils will not go over that, it is often that's been the cause of it. Now what I do is I actually put a bit of sandpaper to the side of me and I sand down my soft pastel sticks and apply my base layers that way with a soft tool or an applicator. But as I say, I go into a lot of detail with this because it is a common problem that a lot of people have. If you are having that problem, it's not really a fault of yours. It's just that too much pigment is being put on that paper. So it's easily fixed for a future project in that it's something you need to be aware of. But if you have done that on a portrait you're currently working on, the only real option you've got is to apply a workable fixative over the top to put back some of that tooth of the paper. Now you can use some softer pencils like the Caran range, and that may go over the soft pastel or the pan pastel area because the pigment is that much softer. but you are going to be limited with how much detail you can get on top. So that is something to bear in mind when you are using that option to put your base layers down. So you can see, like with all my other videos, I work in small areas at one time. Once I've got each area up to about 80% complete, I then move on to the next bit. So once these areas are in, you will then need to tweak the area next to it that is about 80-90% complete. That is absolutely normal. But this is the way that I like to work in order to not feel so daunted about a project. If you look at a pet portrait and you do not know where to start, don't tackle it all in one go. Don't do one whole base layer and then go on with your pencils on top. Focus on one area at a time. Start off with the eye, work above the eye, do the ear, and so on, and move on in stages, exactly like how you see me work with my various videos that I've been putting up recently with voiceover. So you'll notice that with this portrait and this fur colour, as with many subjects, once you've found the set colours that you find that work, it's a matter of switching between these various pencils and going between layers. So once you've got to that stage, it becomes a bit easier and the process becomes a bit quicker because you're that much more confident with the order of the layering of the pencils that you've sort of narrowed down within your sets. So you can see that I've managed to still get a nice amount of fur detail direction there, and that's because I'm working with light layers and I'm working from dark to light is the main concept that you need to follow. Like I say, you can go in with your darker colours on top to break up these layers because you want to try and make as much detail as you can. So swapping between your lights and your darks is a really nice way to do that. The thing that you're trying to do is each layer you build on top, you're not trying to cover the layer underneath. You still want that layer underneath and the previous layers that you've spent all that time working on to show through. Now, one of the biggest areas and the biggest topics that I cover in my Patreon videos is how I hold the pencils to achieve various pencil strokes that I'm after. So depending on the type of fur that you're drawing, holding your pencil in specific ways with the amount of pressure that is applied, you will get different pencil strokes for the desired effect that you're after. So I go in depth in a lot of this, but you can see most of the time I'm holding it at the middle of the barrel of the pencil, and that's because I'm trying to get light pressure. Depending on how you hold your pencil and the pressure applied, you will create different fur strokes depending on the breed and the fur type that you're after. So curly fur will require a slightly different pencil stroke to something like this with a Labrador. So I go in depth in this throughout all of my videos depending on the subjects that I'm working on. Now, what I'm doing, rather than just launching my Patreon channel straight away, I am working on making sure that there's various content there so that there is a small library so that people who subscribe automatically have content available that they can watch right away. So that's why I haven't gone ahead and launched it at the moment, but I am hoping to have it launched within the next 2 to 4 weeks. I just want to make sure that I've got this content up there and available to people, like I say, that they can watch right away. I will just mention that on my Patreon channel it is going to be predominantly pet portraits and various different breeds. So there'll be the odd wildlife one in there as well, but it will be mainly focusing on different breeds that come with different markings, different fur types. So as I continue to build my Patreon channel with the various videos that will be uploaded over the time, will mean that there should be something for everybody. When you are working on parts of a portrait such as the tail here, make sure you put as much time into these areas as you do the rest of the portrait, because it really does show if there's an area that sometimes people think it doesn't require as much attention because it's not as important as the head, for instance. Well, that's not the case. If there's an area there which you haven't put as much time in compared to the other bit, it really does show. So make sure areas like this you pay just as much attention to, because it really will make the portrait that much better as an end result. Now, what we decided to do with this portrait is add a subtle shadow underneath so that she didn't look like she was floating on the portrait. So as you can see, I'm putting some black down and then I'm blending it out with my soft tool and then applying a grey which is of a similar tone to the colour paper to blend out that and get a really nice soft shadow underneath. I often do like doing the shadow because it's nice and subtle. We were going to originally put grass underneath, but I thought that that would, really distract from her really nice fur colour that she's got. So we opted for something a little bit more subtle, which is why we chose to go with the shadow in the end. Now, these legs are obviously quite small in relation to the size of the portrait, so you're not going to be wanting to put as much detail in, but as you can see, I'm focusing on putting my dark's in the right place and my light's in the right place. That dark area just above her foot is because that's where the wrist joint is, and it's just that part of the wrist is casting a shadow on the rest of the leg. So it's because there is that bony formation there, like what I mentioned earlier about making sure you follow the skeletal system of the dog, and that is exactly what that is. So getting these values in place is what will make your portrait that much more realistic over making sure you've got the right colour. The colour is not the be all and end all. If you see me pick up a light yellow, a light cream, just in your set pick up something that you think looks similar. And as I say, if you are working on a subject like this, the Derwent Burnt Ochre, I think I said it was, is the really nice colour for this base layer. So this foot here, you have to make sure that if you are working on something similar, that this foot is darker than all the rest. That's because it is underneath her and it is not getting as much light than the rest of her paws. If I was to make this foot as light as the others, it would make it look like the foot is further in front of the portrait. By darkening it up, you're automatically pushing that foot further to the back and making her front paws appear further forward, which is exactly what you want. So once I'm pretty happy with the portrait, that's when I step back, and which is why I've zoomed out on the camera here, and just add some really subtle details. And the last thing I usually add is the whiskers. And the reason for that is, like what I'm doing now, is the whiskers overlap everything else. If you put them in too soon, it means you have to work around them and it's a little bit of a nightmare. I hope this video was of use. Don't forget to pop any suggestions in the comments below if there's any content you want me to make for future videos on YouTube here. And if you give the video a like, I really would, that would be great because it really does help. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button if you'd like to get notified of future content. So I'll next be uploading a voiceover video on Tuesday. But like I say, if Patreon is of interest to you, don't hesitate to get in touch with me over on my social media or email, or again in the comments below is absolutely fine. Thank you, bye.